Proverbs chapter 14 verse 13. Even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. Job chapter 6 verse 2. Oh, that my grief were truly weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances together. Job chapter 14 verse 22. But his flesh upon him shall have pain, and his soul within him shall mourn. Job chapter 9 verse 18. He will not suffer me to take my breath, but filleth me with bitterness. Psalm chapter 25 verse 18. Look upon mine affliction and my pain, and forgive all my sins. Psalm chapter 38 verse 6. I am troubled, I am bowed down greatly, I go mourning all the day long. Psalm chapter 119 verse 28. My soul melteth for heaviness, strengthen thou me according unto thy word. Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 18. When I would comfort myself against sorrow, my heart is faint in me. Lamentations chapter 5 verse 15. The joy of our heart is ceased, our dance is turned into mourning. Mark chapter 16 verse 10. And she went and told them that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. Romans chapter 9 verse 2. That I have great heaviness and continual sorrow in my heart. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 39. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Job chapter 3 verse 10. Because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from mine eyes. Job chapter 7 verse 11. Therefore I will not refrain my mouth, I will speak in the anguish of my spirit, I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Job chapter 16 verse 6. Though I speak, my grief is not assuaged, and though I forbear, what am I eased? Psalm chapter 42 verse 7. Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts, all thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. Psalm chapter 56 verse 8. Thou tellest my wanderings, put thou my tears into thy bottle, are they not in thy book? Psalm chapter 77 verse 10. And I said, This is my infirmity, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. Psalm chapter 116 verse 3. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell gat hold upon me, I found trouble and sorrow. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 verse 17. All his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. Jeremiah chapter 20 verse 18. Wherefore came I forth out of the womb to see labor and sorrow, that my days should be consumed with shame? Ezekiel chapter 21 verse 6. Sigh therefore, thou son of man, with the breaking of thy loins, and with bitterness sigh before their eyes. Matthew chapter 17 verse 23. And they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again. And they were exceeding sorry. Luke chapter 22 verse 45. And when he rose up from prayer, and was come to his disciples, he found them sleeping for sorrow. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 19. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. Ezekiel chapter 31 verse 15. Thus saith the Lord God, in the day when he went down to the grave I caused a mourning, I covered the deep for him, and I restrained the floods thereof, and the great waters were stayed, and I caused Lebanon to mourn for him, and all the trees of the field fainted for him. Ezra chapter 9 verse 5. And at the evening sacrifice I rose up from my heaviness, and having rent my garment and my mantle, I fell upon my knees, and spread out my hands unto the Lord my God. Psalm chapter 31 verse 10. For my life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing, my strength faileth because of mine iniquity, and my bones are consumed. Psalm chapter 88 verse 9. Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction, Lord, I have called daily upon thee, I have stretched out my hands unto thee. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 27. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 2. while the sun, or the light, or the moon, or the stars, be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. Isaiah chapter 5 verse 30. And in that day they shall roar against them like the roaring of the sea, and if one look unto the land, behold darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. Isaiah chapter 13 verse 8. And they shall be afraid, pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them, they shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth, they shall be amazed one at another, their faces shall be as flames. Isaiah chapter 17 verse 11. In the day shalt thou make thy plant to grow, and in the morning shalt thou make thy seed to flourish, but the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 3 through 4. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Jeremiah chapter 45 verse 3. Thou didst say, Woe is me now! For the Lord hath added grief to my sorrow, I fainted in my sighing, and I find no rest. Lamentations chapter 1 verse 2. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks, among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her, they are become her enemies. Lamentations chapter 2 verse 5. The Lord was as an enemy, he hath swallowed up Israel, he hath swallowed up all her palaces, he hath destroyed his strongholds, and hath increased in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. Ezekiel chapter 2 verse 10. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations, and mourning, and woe. Hosea chapter 4 verse 3. Therefore shall the land mourn, and every one that dwelleth therein shall languish, with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven, yea, the fishes of the sea also shall be taken away. Revelation chapter 18 verse 7. How much she hath glorified herself, and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her, for she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Genesis chapter 44 verse 29. And if ye take this also from me, and mischief befall him, ye shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Job chapter 2 verse 12. And when they lifted up their eyes afar off, and knew him not, they lifted up their voice, and wept, and they rent every one his mantle, and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. Psalm chapter 10 verse 14. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thy hand, the poor committeth himself unto thee, thou art the helper of the fatherless. Proverbs chapter 23 verse 29. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? Lamentations chapter 1 verse 5. Her adversaries are the chief, her enemies prosper, for the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions, her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. Lamentations chapter 2 verse 13. What thing shall I take to witness for thee? What thing shall I liken to thee, O daughter of Jerusalem? What shall I equal to thee, that I may comfort thee, O virgin daughter of Zion? For thy breach is great like the sea, who can heal thee? Amos chapter 8 verse 10. And I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation, and I will bring up sackcloth upon all loins, and baldness upon every head, and I will make it as the mourning of an only son, and the end thereof as a bitter day. Revelation chapter 18 verse 8. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death, and mourning, and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. Genesis chapter 42 verse 38. And he said, My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in the which ye go, then shall ye bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Deuteronomy chapter 26 verse 14. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning, neither have I taken away aught thereof for any unclean use, nor given aught thereof for the dead, but I have hearkened to the voice of the Lord my God, and have done according to all that thou hast commanded me. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 33. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept, and as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son! Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. Psalm chapter 30 verse 11. Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing, thou hast put off my sackcloth, and girded me with gladness. Isaiah chapter 25 verse 7. And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. Psalm chapter 80 verse 5. Thou feedest them with the bread of tears, and givest them tears to drink in great measure. Lamentations chapter 3 verse 32. But though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. Psalm chapter 32 verse 10. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall compass him about. Isaiah chapter 14 verse 3. And it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow, and from thy fear, and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. Isaiah chapter 65 verse 14. Behold, my servants shall sing for joy of heart, but ye shall cry for sorrow of heart, and shall howl for vexation of spirit. Revelation chapter 21 verse 4. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. John chapter 16 verse 20. Verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye shall weep and lament, but the world shall rejoice, and ye shall be sorrowful, but your sorrow shall be turned into joy. Job chapter 16 verse 5. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief. Psalm chapter 90 verse 10. The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Psalm chapter 90 verse 15. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years wherein we have seen evil. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 1. So I returned, and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Isaiah chapter 35 verse 10. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads, they shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Isaiah chapter 51 verse 11. Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return, and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy shall be upon their head, they shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning shall flee away. Isaiah chapter 54 verse 4. Fear not, for thou shalt not be ashamed, neither be thou confounded, for thou shalt not be put to shame, for thou shalt forget the shame of thy youth, and shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more. Isaiah chapter 60 verse 20. Thy sun shall no more go down, neither shall thy moon withdraw itself, for the Lord shall be thine everlasting light, and the days of thy mourning shall be ended. Philippians chapter 2 verse 27. For indeed he was sick nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Isaiah chapter 61 verse 3. To appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. Esther chapter 9 verse 22. As the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 13. Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, both young men and old together, for I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them, and make them rejoice from their sorrow. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 3. And I wrote this same unto you, lest, when I came, I should have sorrow from them of whom I ought to rejoice, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. Job chapter 42 verse 11. Then came there unto him all his brethren, and all his sisters, and all they that had been of his acquaintance before, and did eat bread with him in his house, and they bemoaned him, and comforted him over all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Every man also gave him a piece of money, and every one an earring of gold. A piece of money, and every one an earring of gold. A piece of money,